morning, everyone. I am Lorraine. I am from Hayat Institute. I'm a nurse by profession. I'm an EMT by practice, and Hayat Institute is a private business on the side. So thank you so much to Ms. Rachel and the organizing team for inviting us to give you some insights on infection prevention and control. I think nowadays, with the ongoing coronavirus, we really need to protect ourselves and make sure that we are safe. Sometimes there are viruses going on around us and we don't know where they're coming from. What we're going to do today is to understand what are infections, what are viruses, where do they come from, and how do they infect us. If we know how they infect us, we will know how to get rid of them. They actually say that infectious diseases such as HIV or influenza spread from one person to the other. However, how they spread, there's a difference. If it's HIV, there's a difference of how it spreads from person to person rather than influenza or your regularly known flu. Infection prevention and infection control are relative terms. And through this entire course, we'll be talking about infection prevention. It will be routinely used rather than the slightly older and more restricted term of infection control. Infection prevention covers all the activities to protect people from getting an infection. For example, it prevents an infection from occurring in general. It also includes all attempts to control or to limit an infection outbreak more than one case with the same causative organism and limit its spread. An infection actually is the presence and multiplication of microorganisms in a tissue or a host. Infections can be localized or can affect the whole body. When we say host, we're talking about where the infection actually grows. We're talking about where does it stay. And when we say localized, we mean to say it can either be to just a certain part of our body or the entire part of the body. Symptoms may not always be noticeable. Therefore, never assume that someone is not carrying an infection just because they don't have a symptom. What do you mean by symptom? Symptoms or signs can either be fever, sweating, pain, or inflammation. But remember, it doesn't mean that when people do not have these symptoms that they are free of infection. So there are some people who might be carrying an infection that is still not presenting signs and symptoms such as fever, sweating, pain, or inflammation. What you see now in the screen is a diagram of what we call your chain of infection. When we say chain of infection, if you are going to look into the circle, we'll start from the top. It says causative agent. When we say causative agent, we're talking about the certain organism that causes the infection, such as your Clostridium, your norovirus, your influenza, or what we are facing right now, your coronavirus. They are the cause. They are the organism. But this organism do not hang in the air. This organism goes, if you're going to go clockwise to the yellow box, we have what you call your reservoir. Your reservoir is where these infections, these organisms, these viruses live. So just like any individual, for us, we need to have a home. The same goes for infections or viruses or organisms. They do have a host or a reservoir or a source. So what are those? It can be humans, it can be animals, it can be environmental surfaces, it can be equipments, it can even be food or water. So now we have identified the organism. Then we know that the organism lives in a certain source or in a certain home. From this home or from this source or from this reservoir, there is a way for this organism to get out of that source or get away from the body before it goes to somebody else. Now, how can these organisms leave our body? It can get out of our body via feces, urine, wound drainage such as blood, pus, vomit, sneeze. Like for example, nowadays with the coronavirus, it can be transmitted via the sneeze. It can be transmitted via coughing or our body fluids that we can transmit via our mouth or our nose. So now we know the organism, we know where they live, we know how they're going to leave a person's body. Now we have what you call mode of transmission. Now they left the person's body, they need to be transmitted to another person's body. How do they get transferred? We get it via contact, such as our hands. That's why wearing of gloves is very important if you know that the other person is infected. Now, the person just sneezed and he touched his nose. And the secretions from his nose transferred to his hands. And here you come, you shook that person's hands and then you touch your nose. That's how it's transmitted. Or, the object was sneezed upon, and in that object, such as maybe, let us say, it's a pen, and the person sneezed and the secretions went into the pen, and you borrowed the pen, you hold it, and then you drop the pen and hold your face or hold your mouth. It can be a way to transmit as well. That's what you call contact via equipment. It can also be droplet infection. That's the reason why we wear masks, because if the person in front of us is having a shower when they're talking and they are carrying infections, we will not get infected from the droplets, or we will not get infected from the sneeze or the droplets that's coming from the nose. It can also be airborne. And this is a little bit more difficult for us to avoid. That's why wearing of the mask in a pandemic like we do have right now is a must, because we don't want to catch what might be getting to us from the air in itself. And of course, we also have a way of getting infections or organisms via food, such as salmonella. For example, we've eaten a raw food and it has already salmonella in it, and it's going to cause us diarrhea, abdominal upset, and such. So we've identified the organism, we've identified the source of the organism, where it's living, how it's getting out of the body, and how it can be transmitted. Now let us say the source of the organism is my body, it came out of my body, and now we talk about portal of entry. When you say portal of entry, how does it get to you? How do you get infected? How it enters your body rather. So it can get into the body via the break in your skin or wound, mucous membranes such as mouth, ears, nose, or via inhalation, just simply by breathing it for airborne organisms. And who are the person at risk? These are the susceptible people. If you have noticed, when we face a period of lockdown and the slow phase of opening the country slowly, we did have restrictions. Children under 12 and elderlies more than 60 are not yet advised, as per last week, to get out of their homes. It was just recently that they were allowed. Why? Because the very young and the very old are what we call the most susceptible risk, the most susceptible people who are going to be open to infections, the very young and the very old, or those what you say immunocompromised. What do you mean by immunocompromised? That their body is not fighting infections very well. Who are they? People who have chronic diseases such as hypertension, diabetes, people who are having chemotherapy, people who have been previously chronically sick and having long-term diseases, or are actually taking medications for chronic diseases. The government of the UAE have recently passed a decree during the time of the coronavirus that people who are chronically ill cannot serve as a frontliner. For the very main reason that if you are a susceptible person, you're a person at risk, they're not going to allow you to be on the front line. So this is the entire cycle. We have to know the organism. We have to know the source of the organism or the reservoir. We have to understand how it gets out from the source. We have to understand how it's transmitted, how it gets out. How it transfers to you, how it gets into your body. And who are these people who are at great risk? This is the entire cycle. As we go along, we are going to frequently come back to this cycle to understand how do we break them? How do we stop it? How do we make sure it doesn't transfer from person to person? You might say, I am safe, I'm in the workplace, I might not be facing this problem. But bear in mind that there are sources of infection in the workplace in itself, such as a person who has already been colonized or infected, including visitors and individuals. Yes, I know that now the country has opened up businesses and even institutions such as a training institute for us. However, we have to make sure that we check a person's temperature, make sure that they're wearing the proper equipment such as the mask, the gloves, and we provide all the time a facility for them to disinfect themselves, such as having sanitizers at least every 2 meters and maintaining social distancing every 2 meters. Why? Because in our own workplace, humans, us, we can be the first source of infection. We may not, remember as we mentioned in the first slide, it doesn't mean that you do not have a symptom that you are free of infection. It doesn't mean you don't have fever, you don't have an inflammation, that you are free of infection. So do not discount that fact. Animals also, particularly in animal breeding places, they can be a source of infection as well. Contaminated surfaces such as the environment or the equipment. That's why in a frequently visiting place wherein we are entertaining people coming in and out, such as banks, we have to make sure that the chairs, the desk will be properly cleaned every turnover of visitors that we are having. There is a way for us to make sure that surfaces will be cleaned, will be free of infection. And of course, in some areas of the world, there are also contaminated water supply that can be a source of an infection. So all of this can be present in our workplace or can be present even in our home. So we have to make sure that we know where these infections might be coming from. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when we understand the chain of infection, we can break it. We can make sure that this infection will not transfer from one person to the other. The chain may be broken at one or more points to stop the spread of infectious disease. It can be from the causative agent, it can be from the reservoir, it can be from the portal of exit, it can be from the mode of transmission, it can be from portal of entry, and it can be from susceptible host. So in any of this cycle, we can actually break it. You might be asking me, Lorraine, how? Here comes again the diagram that I've presented to you earlier. But now, we will see above every cycle of it, the term, how do we control them? Causative agent or the pathogenic organism. How do we control them? We can try to reduce incidence of the disease or eliminate the organism via immunization. We already have what you call the flu vaccine. However, we have not yet developed a vaccine against coronavirus in itself. But if a vaccine is present, it can actually provide us our immunity for us not to get that disease or not to get that infection. That's why from the causative agent in itself, immunization is one of the best ways to control. If you're watching in the news, it's been up and down that they have been trying their very best to come up with a vaccine. Why? Because having a vaccine, meaning to say, we will be immunized. If we will be immunized, it will rapidly decline or even reach a point of eradicating the disease in itself. Now that's for your causative agent. We'll move on to your reservoir or to the source. How do we control this organism when they are inside their homes? Remember, their homes can be humans, can be animals, can be objects, equipments, surfaces. How do we control it? Let's eliminate the reservoir. Make sure that each one of us will have good hygiene practices. For equipments, for surfaces, we make sure that there is proper cleaning. For animal or rearing facilities such as breeding places, poultry houses, or where animals are being taken care of, there should be proper hygiene as well. There should also be a source isolation or a care worker exclusion. You might ask me, what's source isolation? You remember, it's a very recent occurrence for all of us. In the coronavirus period, if you are exposed to somebody who had turned out positive for coronavirus, they are expected to go on quarantine for 40 days. This is what we mean by source isolation. In that 14 days, this person who got in contact with another person who's positive to coronavirus has to be away from other people. It should be isolated, because this isolation would actually mean to lessen the chance of this person to spread it to other people. The source has to be away from the others. Now, we are able to control the causative agent via immunization, the reservoir by good hygiene practices, isolation, and care worker exclusion. How do we control its exit from our body? How do we make sure, for example, God forbid, I do have an infection right now, how do I stop it from leaving my body? I have to make sure that I have to reduce the chance of that organism to leave my body. Let's take flu. Maybe I'm having a flu, I was having fever, I was coughing, I'm having runny nose. How do I make sure that I do not infect somebody else, that it doesn't leave my body? I have to wear face mask, I have to wear dressings, and I have to maintain good hygiene. Whenever I sneeze, I have to wash my hands to make sure that if anyone touches me, I will not be able to transmit that. I have to keep the mask on so that when I sneeze or when I cough, I don't transfer that droplet from me to the other person. Now, that has been controlled. I'm aware I have the infection. I don't want that infection to leave my body. Now, how do I control the mode of transmission? Now, I'm working in Hayat. I'm in a Hayat Institute right now. Let us say this is a face-to-face class. And you guys are sitting in front of me. How do I stop the mode of transmission? I have to make sure that I keep hand hygiene and I don't touch any of you. I have to make sure that the room has been properly cleaned so that I will make sure that whatever droplets I have had inside the room, if you touch that area, you won't get infected. There should be general hygiene for everybody. And in terms of infections that is found in food, there should be proper food hygiene. Now, I have controlled it. I've made sure that the environment is free of the transmission. How do you make sure it doesn't get to you? How do you control the portal of entry? You now are the entry points because the infection is from me. That's my exit. Transmission is how do I transfer it to you, and how do you receive it is the portal of entry. How do you not receive it? Make sure that you also apply good hygiene practices. That's why hand washing, or alcohol rub is very important nowadays. You have to wear the mask correctly. You have to wear gloves correctly, not only to wear, you also have to know how to remove gloves correctly. So only when we wear and do it correctly, then we will be assured that we are going to be safe. Don't worry, because we will also be tackling today how to wear and to remove properly the gloves, how to wear masks, and how to do proper hand hygiene. We'll be taking it down one by one. And for the people at risk, make sure that you are going to stay in a protective isolation and always have adequate nutrition. In a period like now, the pandemic, this is not the perfect time to go on your low-carb diet or a ketogenic diet, because now we have to make sure that we are properly or adequately eating and having proper nutrition. We are taking our supplements, our vitamins, because maybe we're not too young and we're not too old, but it doesn't mean that we're not at risk. We are still, but maybe we're not the highest priority to be at risk. But it does not excuse us from taking care of ourselves. Good exercise, good sleep, adequate nutrition is a must for us not to get infected. So we tackled this same diagram as per its definition. We tackled this entire diagram, how to control every single part of it, because controlling every single part of it will actually mean that we can break that cycle. We will break that cycle and that infection will not transfer from you to me, or from me to you, or from me to the general public, or vice versa. Understanding this is very important for us at this very point in our era that we are living in with the coronavirus pandemic. Do we have a question so far? I'll take your silence as none, so let's move on. Okay, as we mentioned, the spread of infection moves on from the causative agent and reservoir, the portal of exit of how it gets out from person to person, the spread of transmission, and in the spread of transmission, we need to understand what are the different spreads of infection. How can it happen? When we say airborne, we mean that it is via respiratory, cough, sneezing, anything from our upper respiratory. When we say fecal oral route, it is something that we have touched something from the feces side and we actually ate. So this is the fecal oral route. It goes back to hand hygiene. When we say contact, it means direct contact from person to person, may it be from touching, from kissing, or from hugging. These are direct contact. And when you say indirect contact, this means to say holding objects that has been infected from an infected person. So sharing of utensils or sharing of glasses, these are indirect contact. When you say parenteral route, this is from IV, intravenous. Blood and body fluids, may it be from an open wound, may it be from blood transmission, may it be from sexual contact. So these are body fluids and blood as well. Animals and insects, such as if you're familiar with dengue, malaria, this comes from insects that can bite us and they are carrying different forms of viruses which will lead to an infection in our body. The mode of transmission, to just define it in a clearer way, it can be direct or indirect. When we say direct, it is from the source to the victim with no objects at all involved. Such as, when a person sneezes or coughs, it is breathed out and then directly breathed in via the person's contaminated hands. That's why hand washing is a must. Hand washing is the golden escape to all the infections, not only to coronavirus. When we say indirect spread, we're talking about contaminated objects, such as your wound, contaminated toilets, contact to surfaces, contaminated food and water. So, when do we wash our hands? All the time. When you go to the toilet, after the toilet, wash your hands. When you enter the building and you have to hold the doorknob, you wash your hands. It's not about being paranoid, but the entire cycle of infection actually comes back to general hand hygiene.
Hand washing should take you about 1 minute. Use a timer or count from 1 to 10 in each of the following steps. Wet hands with water and apply enough soap to cover all surfaces of the hands. Let the water run smoothly to avoid touching the tap later on. Rub hands palm to palm to obtain a good quantity of foam. Then rub right palm over the back of left hand with interlaced fingers, and vice versa. Rub again palm to palm with fingers interlaced. Rub the back of your fingers to opposing palms with fingers interlocked, repeating this action for each hand. Rub rotationally left thumb clasped in right palm, and vice versa. To clean the tips of the fingers, rub rotationally backwards and forwards with clasped fingers of right hand in left palm, and vice versa. Rinse hands thoroughly with running water. Dry hands thoroughly with a single-use towel. If the tap is not elbow-operated, use this towel to turn off the tap without touching it directly. Your hands are now clean and safe.